Great. Hey, everybody. My name is Tusman. I'll give you my real title. I'm Associate Professor of New Media and Computer Science. I'm at SUNY Purchase College in New York. I'm currently on sabbatical, and I'm based in Berlin currently. And I'm excited to visit. This is my first time in Sheffield. Today I'm speaking about encoding and experimenting with vernacular quilt patterns. I'll put this info at the end of my talk too, but just if you're looking for me online, Lee Tusman, there's my website. I also have a podcast called Artists and Hackers. It is on art and code and community. Would love to interview a lot of the artists and programmers and educators and weavers and other pattern makers here that have been here this weekend. Going to start here. I'm from Pennsylvania, specifically from Philadelphia, not too far from Amish country. These are quilt blocks on the bank barn. These are various patterns. Now, growing up, I actually have a mother who is not a quilter, but she does embroidery and sewing. And from a young age, not only did we visit Amish country, but my mother would actually do embroidery of Amish quilts. And so these kinds of patterns are something that I absorbed from a really, really early age. As I got older and just out of college, so I started sewing from a young age, but just out of college, I started making my own quilts. This is my studio about 15 years ago. I have a Juki industrial in the bottom left there. There's a piece I'm working on in the top center, and then scraps on the floor that I'm cutting out, and then on the right side is another quilt. Here's some of my earlier finished work. These are 5 different quilts. It's hard to tell the scale here in a projection, but some of these are quite large. I only know feet, not meters and centimeters, sorry. So. You do it, great. So these are like, the one on the top right is probably like 10 feet wide, 6 feet high. The one on the bottom right is actually the biggest. That I think is 12 or 13 feet high. In addition to using fabric textiles, I use Tyvek envelopes, shoes, things like this, all sewn together. Right here, this one is a variation on a housetop pattern. Come back to these patterns in a second. So this didn't come out of nowhere. I mentioned before being raised near Amish country and really enjoying quilts from that region. But I also want to talk about some other quilts that influenced me too. These are Gee's Bend quilts. These come from the Gee's Bend quilters in Gee's Bend, Georgia. Really long history. And I just have a few of many, many, many patterns that you could see, many quilts that you could see. Loretta Petway is one of my favorite quilters from that community. In the center, there's this absolutely gorgeous housetop pattern, also from Lucy Mingo. And the housetop pattern is one of my favorite quilt patterns. On the right, you can see the other part of quilting. When you just look at a quilt, you don't necessarily see this, but maybe you think of it, which is like, how are quilts assembled? Many of you might be aware that quilting actually refers to the technique of sewing the front to the back with some batting in between, right? It's the actual connection through those 3 layers. That's quilting, and it's often done in matriarchal quilting communities. Women gather and they do the quilting together. And I don't necessarily mean they sew the front together. I do think that occasionally it happens, but it's often that people will bring the front, essentially, of the quilt, and then they actually quilt through it together to assemble. And again, I mentioned Amish quilting. These are some Amish quilts. In the bottom left, there's the Roman bars pattern. In the center, there's the bars pattern. And in the bottom right, there's a log cabin pattern. Okay, so these are geometric patterns, largely, though not entirely, square. Triangles obviously figure, and there are non-triangle, non-square patterns as well, but these are by far the most common. Okay, so I'm going to jump to a live code for a second here. Just going to actually, I said live code, but it's honestly. Several years ago, I got really big into this game engine called PuzzleScript. PuzzleScript is an open source HTML5 puzzle game engine for making largely top-down games. Oh, it doesn't work in this browser. It's okay. You can see these are square patterns, right? If we click to make a game, so the whole editor works inside a browser. On the left, you have basically your engine here. It is a programming language. You actually you write a pattern-based language here. Here you draw your levels out, and you actually make your sprites, that's the word I'm looking for. In the top left, you could just start with just a color, but I'm going to load an example like an eyeball. Here's an eyeball right here. You can see how it's done in this pattern. Here is a little person. This is the player. I'll click to start. Okay, so here's our player, right? You can see the player on the right side of the screen. You can see the players drawn here with colors and the individual pixels, again with the eyeball here. And then we have our rules for moving the player around. Okay, if I move the player right, click in here. Okay, so the eyeball follows the player. That's what this says right here. This is my little setup. You can see this is a 5x5 grid. This is when I got interested in basically low resolution grids. So this is kind of my impetus right here. So we're going to jump back here. Okay, put that aside for a second. We're going to come back to that. Has anyone heard of NaNoGenMo? Okay, I see a few hands. NaNoGenMo stands for National Novel Generating Month. It's an idea originally by Darius Kazemi in 2013. Darius had read that National Novel Writing Month, which is much more popular and common, only requires that you turn in 50,000 words. That is a novel. So they didn't explain how you had to generate the 50,000 words. So this is when Darius came up with the National Novel Generating Month, something that I've participated in for the past decade. And this year I got an idea to create a 50,000 word series of poems, essentially, using quilt patterns. The way that you participate is you open an issue on the GitHub for NaNoGenMo each year. I posted that I wanted to participate making quilt poems. But I couldn't find any patterns of quilts. I found lots of weaving patterns. I found player piano patterns, but no quilt patterns. So I started making my own. And first I just assembled a list of quilt types, and I think I maybe did 25, 30, something like that. Okay, so the next step is, how do you actually get these patterns, since I couldn't find them? Now we jump back to that PuzzleScript thing. I chose a very low resolution to start. I chose an 8x8 grid. This is for a few reasons, but partly because I could visually look at a quilt and translate it into an 8x8 grid. So here's an example. This is one of the G's Ben quilts. This is a housetop pattern. This is, on the left, me turning it into an 8x8 grid. These numbers represent different color blocks. And this is just one version of a housetop pattern right here. Okay, so this is how I encoded it. I could show more examples, but I'm just going to actually show what I did with this next. So next, I made a series of experiments This is one example. I'm picking from a corpora of lots of different bodies of text to create some poems. This is from early on. This is basically my devlog as I'm attempting to make quilt poems, visual poems, in the pattern of various quilts. And instead of colors, although here you see it with colors, I'm pulling a word for each color and assembling a quilt. That was the first version. I decided I did not love that and that it didn't need color. So I'm going to show a few examples here. I ended up making a chapbook, but in that process I also assembled a quilt a day, or a quilt poem a day website where each day it generates a poem. And again, these patterns are derived from that encoded 8x8 pattern system, where instead of color, each of those numbers represents a word. And it's pulling from a different corpus of text for each of these poems. Here's a bar. We saw the Amish bar pattern earlier. Another one down here. Actually, there's a few bar patterns. There's a checkerboard pattern here for this quilt. This is a bullseye quilt, so it goes towards the center and diagonals and then in a cross. Again, I assembled a chapbook with these poems and then distributed them, and I actually have some with me, which I'm happy to distribute to people. I can run this live in my terminal. Okay, so I just generated, I think, 1,333 poems. And here's the daily quilt poem. The next experiment that I did, I worked with feeding in my own photography and using that same pattern, picking snippets of photos and animating them. So you can see some examples here. In the top left, it lists the pattern that it's drawing from. So this is a variation on crazy quilting. Another one. The little coins quilt is a personal favorite. I experimented with these photo grids being static as well. I happen to like the animation. Show one or two more. Lazy gal, or basically sideways bars. These names are informal. They're passed down. Some of the patterns have multiple names depending on the community that they're from. Okay. This is Pico 8. You can see, whoops, I forgot how to reload. But anyway, doesn't matter. Next, I used the same quilt patterns, adding some fake stitching, as you can see here. This is in Pico 8, which is a game engine that I really like and use. The same creator, Pico 8, which comes from Lex Lawful or Zep, also made Picotron. This is the newest, which is a virtual workstation or a fantasy workstation. I'm going to run it inside of Picotron. This time, I'm using kind of a fake 3D effect with these. They look like balls, they're circles. And to give this kind of 3D effect, again, feeding the exact same data in with just very slight variations on my code. Lastly, I just want to talk about maybe my next steps. This is something I'm very much in the middle of. One thing is 8x8 is obviously not a standard size for a quilt. Quilting has no standard size. So I've started to experiment with much larger grids. This also allows me to do kind of pseudo triangle patterns, which are pretty common in quilting. Another thing I want to do next is digital embroidery, taking it back. Again, it started as a textile. I've encoded it into this digital format, but then using digital embroidery machines to using these patterns. Experimenting with weaving. because these patterns actually could be woven. Adding more quilt patterns, I think at this point I have 36. And then kind of the final thing I want to do is, it's really natural and normal in quilting to have all these variations. Okay, we have the housetop pattern, but if you do 4 of them and then one of them gets switched upside down, well then that's another variation. And these are not formalized in any way, it's just a natural part of quilting to experiment with that. So maybe building in some generative process to actually get even more variation. Again, my name is Lee Tusman. Here's my contact information and my podcast. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Lee. I too am originally from near Amish country and found that very exciting, so exciting. Is there any questions or comments from the audience?
Hi, thank you for that. That was really interesting. I was interested particularly in your use of game engines, and wondered whether that came from previous experience with game engines, or it just kind of fitted what you wanted to do. Like, what's the reasoning there?
Great question. Thanks. I love game engines, and I make my own and use them all the time. I think games have I think various of these pattern communities, right? I'm going to say this is the pattern community, but there's also obviously these subset of pattern communities. And there's a whole ecosystem in that particular thing. It could be knitting or weaving or live coding, right? I think that's true around games in general. I think they provide a nice package to some degree. There's a framing when you use a game engine. And I think that's something that I really like. Particularly, I showed Pico 8 before, and Pico 8 has a sprite editor built in, a code editor, a sound editor, all in there. The same is true with PuzzleScript, and I think providing constructive constraints is something that really excites me, maybe obvious in the 8x8 grids. So I think that's why I'm drawn to them to some degree.
Great, thanks. Is there any other, probably time for 1 or 2 more questions? Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think I heard you say you used shoes in your early quilts. Is that correct?
I have. I had an industrial machine, so.
Okay, I was just curious about how a shoe, which is a 3D object, ends up in a quilt.
I think I did that one once, but if we jump back here, okay, let's see. There's some envelopes here, clothes with holes in them. I don't know. I always found it a challenge and kind of fun to use other materials. When you have an industrial, you can kind of sew whatever you want. So, yeah, it'll take it.
One final question from anybody? Yep.
Sorry, maybe I missed it, but you mentioned a couple other quilting communities. Is there like cross dialogue between the digital versions of these and then the analog communities? And like, what do you see the relationship between the two of them?
It's a great question. I don't think there's a digital quilting community. If there is, I don't know it yet. Maybe there is. Although actually through the process of preparing this and getting feedback from reviewers, I did learn of lots of people working in this field and realm. And if you have other suggestions, come up and tell me. I'd love to hear more, or get in contact if you're streaming online. I don't know how much dialogue there is between different communities, between the digital and those that are, let's say, analog sewing and quilting and things like that. I don't know personally. In my previous experience, when I used to sew quilting, I didn't know much about people that are coming from maybe a computational background or interest. So I don't know how much of that is in flux between the two, but to me, just like the Algorithmic Pattern Salon brings together these various different communities, it seems like a natural way.
Maybe you should set one up.
Happy to. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Lee.
You.